The policies of integration implemented in Canada during the 1950s and 60s had the effect of producing a generation of Cree who did not learn to read or write in Cree syllabics, and thus, despite the prominence of syllabics amongst older generations, this generational gap in functional literacy with Cree syllabics led to concern for the future of the language and the initiation of programs aimed at reintegrating Cree syllabics into regional educational programs. In an echo of the missionaries more than 150 years earlier, in 1970, Dr. Douglas Ellis was commissioned to produce a written language for Cree using Roman orthography instead of their syllabary. He argued that due to most Cree already having to learn English, also presenting them with syllabics would be too large of a learning load for the students. Ellis also downplayed the practicality of Cree syllabics, arguing that reproduction was too expensive and therefore limited the availability of resources in Cree syllabic script. John Stewart Murdoch was an avid supporter of incorporating Cree syllabics into Cree education and argues passionately against both of Ellis's points. To the first, he describes the emotional and cultural engagements of students when they are learning syllabics, and how the relative ease with which they are able to master the language provides significant motivation for the lessons. Murdoch also argues that the structure of syllabics provides a stepping stone for students to learn of the concepts of phonetics and syllables, thus aiding with their study of the English language. To Ellis's second point regarding the price of printing, Murdoch points out that not only do most modern printing techniques not rely on typesetting, but that Olivetti Underwood has been manufacturing affordable Cree syllabic typewriters since 1970, and that IBM had produced a Cree syllabics type ball. Indeed, the Cree Way project, of which Murdoch was involved, demonstrated how the tools that were available to Cree living in even remote locations along James Bay, including Cree syllabic typewriters, provided them with the means to produce volumes of material in Cree syllabics to remedy a lack of such resources. The Cree Way project sought to implement a bilingual education program which incorporated the use of Cree syllabics into the curriculum taught to Cree students living in remote areas along the shores of James Bay. In the context of this educational initiative, Murdoch indicates that the widely dispersed population of Cree speakers living in this region were able to use a variety of printing techniques in order to produce an abundance of educational materials for teaching the Cree language using syllabics. The direct impact of the typewriter is unclear. However, Murdoch does indicate that it was one of the tools used in producing the educational material used in the Cree Way project. However, Murdoch describes difficulties that were encountered during the instruction of Cree syllabics that were caused by local variation in the form of the symbols and of the syllabary. There was little desire for cooperation amongst groups to develop uniformity in the syllabary beyond what was practical for the group. Thus, the Cree syllabic typewriter may have provided a mechanism for the production of clearly typed material in Cree syllabics, but it is likely that not all Cree individuals would have identified with the form of the language produced by a standardized set of type. However, the teaching materials that were produced, at least in part through the use of a Cree syllabics typewriter, aided in revitalizing a functional written literacy in Cree syllabics. The production of the first Cree syllabic typewriter in 1878 provided an exception from a history where Cree syllabic printing depended on large equipment not available to the First Nations themselves. Thus, during the long history of the Cree syllabary, the vast majority of printed materials were motivated by religious or administrative purposes, leaving the Cree to rely on handwritten text for their own cultural purposes. However, with the manufacture of Cree syllabic typewriters in the 1970s, Cree First Nations became empowered with the capacity to produce typed documents and manuscripts that could be reproduced and distributed more easily than handwritten documents. Murdoch points out that most of the typewriters produced were used by the Department of Indian Affairs, but that a small number ended up being used by the Cree themselves. That a Cree syllabics typewriter was developed in the first place was largely the result of the administrative ambitions of religious leaders initially and subsequently the state of Canada to control and indoctrinate the Cree First Nations, who were prominent in large parts of Canada. The ease with which Cree syllabics could be placed onto an English keyboard would have also contributed to the viability of producing a small number of the machines. At the time that the first Cree syllabics typewriter was produced, the use of syllabics was ubiquitous amongst the Cree, and the materials produced using early Cree syllabic typewriters remained largely in the administrative realm. However, as the Cree language suffered during the 1950s and 60s from efforts to suppress the language in favor of English, the production of Cree syllabic typewriters in the 1970s provided an accessible method for educational material to be produced towards the goal of reviving the Cree syllabic cultural tradition. For contemporary Cree, the materials that were produced on a Cree syllabic typewriter may in fact not be the most important contribution of the typewriter for Cree syllabics. Rather, the archival nature of the keyboard itself, which displays the symbols of a syllabary that has provided a map of a written language to generations of Cree, may now provide a map for contemporary Cree, seeking to connect with their cultural roots, which extend back before the typewriter. Thus, a tool once largely used by administrative officials seeking to erase the Cree's cultural legacy may now provide a map laid out on the keyboard of an old typewriter.